Please don't embarrass me in front of my new friends. Today, you are a nobody here. The words slipped from my daughter Lucia's lips like shards of ice, a perfectly aimed whisper designed to cut deeper than any public scream. We were standing near the towering seven-tiered wedding cake I had paid for, surrounded by the opulent splendor of a celebration I had single-handedly funded. Her eyes, cold and distant, held no trace of the little girl I had raised. Instead, they reflected the calculated cruelty of a stranger. In that single devastating moment, the culmination of years of growing unease and quiet observation crystallized into a painful, undeniable truth. For her, I was no longer a father. I was a transaction that had just been completed, a ghost at a feast paid for with my life's work. Before I continue, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. My name is Roberto, and at 68 years old, I've learned that the most astute investments aren't in stocks or bonds, but in people. I spent 40 years of my life as an investment consultant, building a substantial fortune from nothing but discipline, foresight, and an unwavering belief in a simple principle: you reap what you sow. I prided myself on my ability to read markets, to see patterns where others saw chaos. This same analytical mind allowed me to provide Lucia with a life of privilege and opportunity I never had, hoping to sow seeds of character and gratitude. I gave her the best education, a fully funded start in her adult life, and a safety net woven from my own sacrifice, always believing that my greatest legacy would be her happiness and integrity. However, over the years I watched a slow, corrosive change take hold of my only daughter. My generosity was no longer seen as a gift, but as an entitlement. My steady, quiet support became a resource to be endlessly exploited. It began subtly, with her casual dismissal of my simpler tastes and a growing obsession with the superficial trappings of high society. The warmth in our relationship was gradually replaced by a transactional chill, her affection becoming conditional, appearing only when she needed something. I saw how her ambition shifted from building a life of her own to simply securing her inheritance. And the loving daughter, I remembered, was slowly being consumed by a cold, calculating greed. This erosion of her character was significantly accelerated by Veronica, her future mother-in-law, a woman who moved through the world as if it were a chessboard, with people as her pawns. In the months leading up to the wedding, I was summoned to Lucia's minimalist, expensive apartment for what they called final chats. These were not conversations. They were strategic meetings. Seated on a pristine white sofa, Lucia and Veronica operated as a single, formidable unit. Their smiles were tools of manipulation. Their words, a carefully veiled script designed to extract the maximum amount of money from me while making me feel as if I were merely fulfilling a traditional, fatherly duty. During one such meeting, they presented me with a revised budget for the wedding flowers, a figure that could have purchased a small car. When I calmly questioned the extravagance, Veronica placed a perfectly manicured hand on Lucia's arm. "Darling," she cooed, looking at me with feigned sympathy, "we must remember that a wedding is not just a union of two souls, but a statement. It sets the tone for Lucia and Marco's entire future." Lucia nodded eagerly, her expression a mixture of impatience and disdain. It was clear I was not being consulted. I was being instructed. They saw my quiet demeanor not as patience, but as the weakness of an old man losing his grip, making their demands more audacious. The venue, the guest list, the designer dress, every detail was a battleground where my role was simply to sign the checks. They spoke of family traditions that had never existed in our family, traditions invented on the spot to justify another lavish expense. I watched them, maintaining a serene exterior that they misinterpreted as compliance. Inside, however, I was a silent observer gathering data. Each exorbitant request, each dismissive glance was another piece of evidence confirming my deepest fears. They didn't see me, Roberto, the man who had built everything. They saw a vault, and they were growing increasingly impatient for the key. The wedding day arrived. A spectacular affair, hosted at a historic countryside villa. Every detail meticulously curated and paid for by me. The air was filled with the scent of 1,000 white roses and the soft murmur of polite society. I moved through the crowd, a ghost in a well-tailored linen suit, observing the fruits of my labor. I saw Lucia, radiant in her gown, laughing with friends who were, in reality, little more than status symbols. I saw Veronica playing the gracious host, accepting compliments for a party she hadn't contributed a single cent to. The entire event felt like a perfectly staged play, and I was beginning to understand my role was that of a silent, uncredited producer. Then came the speeches. Marco the groom spoke warmly, if briefly, thanking everyone. Then Lucia took the microphone, her voice clear and confident. She thanked her new husband, his family, and then launched into a long, effusive tribute to Veronica, praising her for being the mother she had always dreamed of having, a guiding light of elegance and strength. The room applauded warmly. As she spoke, she scanned the room, her eyes gliding past me without a flicker of acknowledgement. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate public erasure. She was rewriting her own history in front of 200 guests. And in her new narrative, I had no significant part. A short while later, as the music swelled and guests began to dance, I approached her. My intention was simple: to congratulate my daughter on her wedding day, a final attempt to salvage a shred of our connection. She was talking to a circle of her new, wealthy friends, their laughter brittle and loud. She saw me coming, and a flash of irritation crossed her face. She excused herself and met me halfway, her smile a tight, artificial mask. It was then, in the manicured perfection of her wedding, that she delivered her final, cruel verdict on my worth. "Please don't embarrass me in front of my new friends. Today you are a nobody here," she whispered. The words hung in the air between us, a definitive statement that severed the last thread of our bond. I looked into her eyes and saw a stranger, a product of an ambition I had unwittingly funded. There was no anger in my heart, no surge of despair. Instead, I felt a profound, chilling calm. This was not the beginning of my pain. It was merely the final piece of evidence I needed, the irrefutable proof that justified the difficult path I knew I now had to take. The humiliation was not the catalyst for my plan. It was simply the trigger. For months, I had been preparing for a moment like this, hoping it would never come, but knowing with the cold certainty of an experienced investor that I had to hedge against the catastrophic failure of my most personal investment. Her cruel dismissal was the final signal, the confirmation that the contingency plan I had so carefully constructed was not only necessary, but just. My reaction wasn't one of a heartbroken father, but of a patient strategist whose final condition had just been met. The game they thought they were winning was already over. In the immediate aftermath of her words, I felt no sting of surprise, only the cold, clear click of a final puzzle piece locking into place. Instead of retreating in shame, I simply gave her a brief, unreadable nod and turned away, leaving her standing alone in her manufactured triumph. I walked through the throng of laughing, champagne-sipping guests, each one a testament to an illusion I had funded, and found a quiet terrace overlooking the manicured gardens. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. My heart wasn't racing with anger. It was beating with the slow, steady rhythm of grim purpose. The time for emotional investment had passed. Now it was a matter of asset management and the execution of a long-decided-upon course of action. My decision was not born in that moment of public humiliation. It was forged over years of quiet observation and growing disappointment. This coldness that settled over me wasn't the absence of feeling, but a shield I had built to protect myself from the inevitable pain of this day. I watched the party from my vantage point, the vibrant lights and joyful music now seeming like a distant, hollow echo. It was a meticulously crafted facade of family and love, and I saw with perfect clarity that I was the only one who knew the truth of its rotten foundations. My mind, trained to see through market volatility and corporate lies, was now focused on a single, controlled demolition. My vengeance wouldn't be a fiery explosion of rage, but a quiet, systematic dismantling of the world they believed they had secured. My calm was not weakness. It was control. It was the absolute self-possession of a man who had already anticipated every move on the chessboard. While Lucia and Veronica saw a doddering old man, easily manipulated and nearing the end of his usefulness. They failed to see the strategist who had spent a lifetime outthinking men far more cunning than them. They celebrated their victory, oblivious to the fact that they were merely acting out the final scene of a play I had written. My grief for the daughter I had lost had been processed long ago, in the silent solitude of my study. What remained was a steely resolve to teach a lesson in consequences, a lesson she had proven herself so desperately in need of. I took a slow breath, the scent of night-blooming jasmine filling the air. My plan was not an act of retaliation, but one of restoration. It was designed to restore a balance that their greed had so thoroughly corrupted. It was about teaching them the true meaning of value, something that couldn't be bought, inherited, or flaunted. The pain they were about to experience was not a punishment inflicted by me, but a natural consequence of their own choices, a debt coming due with interest. I felt a strange sense of peace in that moment, the peace that comes from knowing you are about to do something difficult, but absolutely necessary. The father in me had finally stepped aside, making way for the pragmatist. The first, most crucial step of my plan had been taken more than a year prior. In the hushed, wood-paneled office of my longtime legal counsel, I remember the weight of the decision as I instructed them to restructure my entire estate. My fortune, the product of a lifetime of work, was not to be a simple inheritance. Instead, we created an irrevocable trust, a financial fortress with walls so high and gates so specific that only a fundamentally changed Lucia would ever find her way inside. It was a complex and meticulously crafted legal instrument, designed not to disown her, but to force her to become a person worthy of a legacy. The core of the trust was built around a series of stringent behavioral clauses. These were not arbitrary rules, but carefully considered milestones for personal growth. To access even a fraction of the funds, Lucia would be required to obtain and maintain full-time employment for a minimum of 2 consecutive years, demonstrating financial independence. She would also need to complete a certified course in personal financial management, proving she could be a steward of wealth, not just a consumer of it. The final, and perhaps most difficult clause, demanded her participation in mandatory family therapy, a condition aimed at addressing the deep-seated character flaws that had led us to this point. Simultaneously, I began a quiet liquidation of my most conspicuous assets. The sprawling family home where Lucia grew up, with its swimming pool and tennis courts, was the first to go. I sold off the luxury cars, the small collection of modern art, and even my membership at the exclusive country club. I moved the vast capital from these sales into discreet, low-profile investment vehicles, managed funds and private equity placements that were nearly impossible to trace without deep financial knowledge. To the outside world, and specifically to Lucia and Veronica, it would appear as though my wealth was steadily diminishing, that I was becoming a man of more modest means in my retirement. This illusion of financial decline was a critical part of the strategy. It was a stress test designed to reveal their true nature. As my perceived net worth shrank, their demands grew more frantic, their manipulation more transparent. They believed they were squeezing the last drops from a drying well, which made them careless. Their frustration at my newfound frugality led them to reveal the depths of their entitlement in ways they never would have if they thought the river of money was endless. They were so focused on the cash, they could see that they never thought to look for the ocean they couldn't. Every interaction became a data point. I meticulously documented their campaign of emotional and financial pressure. I saved text messages where Lucia lamented my stinginess and Veronica offered her advice on how to handle me. I made notes after phone calls where they would tag team their requests, layering guilt and expectation with practiced ease. This wasn't just for my own records, it was evidence. Each outrageous demand, each manipulative plea served to validate the very clauses I had embedded within the trust. They were, in effect, building the case against themselves, proving day by day why they could not be trusted with an unconditional inheritance. The linchpin of the entire plan, however, was an alliance forged in secret. Weeks before the wedding, I invited Marco, my future son-in-law, to lunch. I had observed him closely. He came from a wealthy family, but he possessed a quiet decency that seemed at odds with the avarice of his mother and fiancée. During our conversation, I steered away from finances and spoke of values, of legacy, and of my concerns for Lucia's happiness, framing it as a worry about her lack of purpose. I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a shared concern that he had likely not dared to voice. He confessed in carefully chosen words that he loved Lucia deeply, but worried that her obsession with status and appearances was eclipsing the kind, vibrant woman he had fallen for. He admitted to feeling uncomfortable with the way his mother and Lucia discussed me, as if I were a business problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. In that moment of shared vulnerability, I knew I could trust him. I didn't reveal the extent of my wealth, but I gave him a key to the truth. At the end of our lunch, I handed him a thick, sealed envelope. My instructions were precise and solemn. "Marco," I said, looking him directly in the eye, "I hope you never have to open this. But life requires us to be prepared. Keep this safe and open it only if you witness Lucia dishonor me in a way that shows she no longer has a heart. If that day comes, you will know what to do." He took the envelope, his expression a mixture of confusion and gravity, and promised to honor my request. He was the one variable they had never considered, the moral compass I had placed at the very center of their greedy machinations. My quiet investigation into Lucia's life had revealed a truth far uglier than I had prepared for. It wasn't just about her desire for luxury. It was a frantic attempt to stay afloat in a sea of debt. Discreet inquiries revealed she was living a life financed by high-interest credit cards and personal loans, all under the assumption that a massive inheritance was imminent and would wipe the slate clean. She wasn't just spending my money, she was spending her future, mortgaging it against my death. The wedding, with all its splendor, wasn't a celebration of love. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble to secure a bailout. This discovery painted her actions in a new, more sinister light. Her impatience wasn't just youthful entitlement. It was the panic of a debtor on the verge of collapse. It explained the increasing pressure, the shameless demands, and the coldness that had crept into her eyes. She wasn't just looking at me as a father, but as a lifeline, and she was starting to resent the fact that I was still holding on to it. The love and affection she once showed had been entirely replaced by a desperate, all-consuming need. The most painful discovery, however, came from a source I had hoped I would never have to consult. A discreet investigator I hired uncovered emails between Lucia and Veronica. In them, they discussed my health with a chilling detachment, speculating on my longevity and outlining their plans for managing my assets after I was gone. They referred to me as the obstacle and debated strategies for gaining power of attorney should my health decline. Reading those words was like a physical blow, a betrayal so profound it stole the air from my lungs. They weren't just waiting for me to pass on. They were actively planning for it, viewing my life as a final inconvenience, standing between them and the fortune they felt was rightfully theirs. This wasn't just greed. It was a macabre sense of entitlement that bordered on ghoulish. Any lingering doubts I had about the severity of my plan vanished. This was no longer just about teaching a lesson in financial responsibility. It was about protecting myself and my life's work from people who saw my death as their ultimate payday. The knowledge of their secret conversations solidified my resolve. into something unbreakable. The pain of their betrayal was immense, but I channeled it not into rage, but into the meticulous perfection of my strategy. Every legal document was reviewed, every loophole closed. The trust was made ironclad, its clauses unassailable. I was no longer just protecting my assets. I was erecting a monument to consequence, ensuring that their actions would have a direct and unavoidable impact on their future. I continued to play the part of the benign, slightly disconnected father, allowing their overconfidence to grow. Their belief in my naivete was their greatest weakness, the blind spot that prevented them from seeing the trap slowly closing around them. They mistook my silence for submission and my calm for resignation. It was a classic investment error. They underestimated the asset, misjudged the market, and failed to do their due diligence. They were about to learn that some investments have a very, very long-term payoff. At the wedding, as I stood on that terrace, I felt a deep, resonant certainty. The pain was real, a dull ache for the daughter I once had, but it was overshadowed by the clarity of my purpose. My plan was a masterpiece of social and financial engineering, designed to strip away everything they valued, status, wealth, and social standing, to force them to confront the poverty of their own characters. It was a controlled burn, designed to clear away the dead wood and just maybe allow for the possibility of new growth. I watched Marco from across the reception hall. After Lucia's humiliating whisper, I had made a point of catching his eye. I saw the shock and dawning comprehension on his face. He looked at Lucia, then back at me, and in that moment I saw him make a choice. He gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. His loyalty was not to the fantasy Lucia was selling, but to the harsh truth she had just revealed. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo, and I knew he was touching the envelope. The trigger I had given him months ago was now in his hand. The weight of what was about to happen was no longer mine to bear alone. I had planted a seed of integrity in the heart of their corrupt enterprise, and it was about to blossom in the most public and spectacular way imaginable. He was my proxy, the agent of a truth they had worked so hard to ignore. The systematic dismantling of their illusion was about to begin. It wouldn't be my voice that condemned them, which was the beauty of the plan. My hands would remain clean. The consequences would be delivered not by the victim they had scorned, but by the man Lucia had chosen as her partner, the man they both believed was their pawn. The irony was exquisite. They had sought to use their marriage to secure a fortune, but instead it would be the very instrument of their downfall. The turning point was no longer a distant possibility. It was seconds away. All the years of planning, the secret meetings, the painful discoveries, it had all converged on this single perfect moment. I took a final steadying breath and walked back inside from the terrace, rejoining the celebration. I found a place where I could watch the main table clearly, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed. The curtain was about to rise on the final act, and I wouldn't miss it for the world. The moment of reckoning began, not with a thunderclap, but with the gentle chime of a champagne glass against a microphone. Marco stood, his expression composed but resolute, capturing the attention of the entire room. A wave of pleasant expectation washed over the guests. They anticipated a final, heartfelt toast from the groom. Lucia beamed at him, a proprietary smile on her face, believing this was another moment to bask in her reflected glory. Veronica adjusted her diamond necklace, ready to accept what she assumed would be more praise. From my position near the back of the hall, I watched them. Two queens reigning over a fool's paradise, completely unaware that their kingdom was about to be wiped from the map. Marco began by thanking the guests for sharing in their joy. His voice was steady, imbued with a seriousness that seemed slightly out of place for a simple toast. Then his eyes found mine across the room, and he gave a slight, respectful nod. "I want to offer a special word of thanks," he said, his voice resonating with sincerity, "to a man whose incredible generosity made this entire beautiful day possible. I'm speaking, of course, of my father-in-law, Roberto." A polite smattering of applause followed, but I saw Lucia's smile falter. A flicker of annoyance crossed her features. This was not in her script. Veronica's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Then Marco turned his gaze directly to his new wife. The warmth in his voice was replaced by a tone of profound disappointment. "Lucia, my love," he said, and the entire hall leaned in, sensing the shift in tone. "Just a short while ago, you told me that your father was a nobody here tonight. I feel it is my duty as your husband to correct you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the now hushed room. "I have just discovered," he continued, his voice ringing with clarity, "that far from being a nobody, he is the silent architect of the entire future you so confidently dream of." With that, he reached into his tuxedo and pulled out the thick envelope I had given him. The crisp sound of the paper as he unfolded the documents seemed to echo in the cavernous silence. I saw Lucia's blood drain from her face, her confident facade beginning to crack as a dawning horror filled her eyes. She knew instinctively that this was an object she could not control, a variable she had never accounted for. Veronica looked from Marco to Lucia, her expression a mask of confusion and rising panic. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick, unbearable tension. Every eye in the room was fixed on the groom and the papers in his hand. "Lucia and Veronica have been under the impression," Marco announced, his voice now devoid of all emotion, "that Roberto's finances were modest. They believed his generosity for this wedding was a final great stretch." He looked down at the top sheet. "According to this certified statement of assets, prepared by his legal team, Roberto's actual net worth is many, many times greater than anyone in this room could have possibly imagined." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Whispers erupted like wildfire as the guests, members of a society that measured a man's worth in numbers, began to recalibrate their entire perception of me. I was no longer the quiet, retired father. I was a power player they had completely overlooked, but Marco was not finished. "However," he continued, raising his voice to cut through the murmurs, "that fortune is not and will never be a simple inheritance." He held up another document. "Roberto, in his wisdom, has placed his entire estate into an irrevocable trust." The legal term hung in the air, a death knell to their aspirations. He then proceeded to read, in a clear and methodical voice, the key clauses I had so carefully drafted. He detailed the requirement for Lucia to secure and maintain a full-time job for 2 years. He explained the mandatory financial management course. And finally, he spoke of the non-negotiable family therapy sessions. "Until these conditions are met," Marco concluded, "all financial support of any kind is permanently and immediately cut off." The world of Lucia and Veronica did not just crumble, it was publicly spectacularly annihilated. The silence in the hall was no longer one of suspense, but of shock. Lucia sat frozen, her face a grotesque canvas of disbelief, rage, and utter humiliation. The designer dress, the perfect hair, the carefully constructed image of the graceful bride, it all dissolved, revealing the grasping, terrified woman beneath. Her awakening to the disaster was not a slow dawning, but a brutal, instantaneous collision with a reality she had refused to see. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of anticipated wealth, and that foundation had just been dynamited in front of everyone she sought to impress. Veronica's reaction was more visceral. For a moment, she seemed to choke on her fury, her face turning a blotchy red that clashed horribly with her emerald gown. Then, with a strangled cry of outrage, she shot up from her seat and lunged for the microphone. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with venom. But Marco was prepared. He simply stepped back, holding the microphone out of her reach, his expression one of calm detachment. Her desperate lunge and screeching cry only served to cement her image as a frantic, grasping harpy, stripping away the last vestiges of her carefully cultivated socialite poise. The humiliation was absolute. The very people whose admiration they had craved were now witnesses to their public disgrace. The guests exchanged shocked glances, their whispers now laced with a delicious, cruel schadenfreude. In the space of 5 minutes, Lucia and Veronica had gone from the envied center of attention to objects of pity and scorn. Their most prized possession, their status, had been rendered worthless. They had tried to erase me from their story, but instead, Marco had made them the pathetic villains in a tale of greed and just deserts. A story that would be gleefully recounted in the city's most exclusive circles for months to come. In the aftermath of Marco's speech, a strange social vacuum formed around the head table. No one approached them. The stream of well-wishers and flatterers that had surrounded them all evening vanished completely. Their so-called friends, the new and important people Lucia had been so eager to impress, now averted their gaze, suddenly fascinated by their dinner plates or engaged in urgent conversations with their neighbors. The social currency of the bride and her mother-in-law had been devalued to zero, and no one wanted to be associated with a failed investment. Their isolation was swift and total. Even Marco's own family, seated nearby, looked at Veronica with a mixture of shame and disgust. Her brother, a prominent banker, pointedly turned his back on her to speak with someone at the next table. Marco, for his part, did not return to his seat. After placing the microphone back on its stand, he walked to the bar at the far end of the room and ordered a glass of water, physically and emotionally distancing himself from the wreckage he had just created. He had drawn a line in the sand, and his wife and mother were on the other side. The fragile alliance between Lucia and Veronica, forged in mutual greed, shattered with predictable violence. Deprived of a common enemy, they turned on each other.
"This is your fault."
Veronica hissed at Lucia, her voice a low, venomous whisper that was nonetheless audible in the tense silence. "I told you he was weak, not stupid. You pushed him too far with your arrogance." Lucia, jolted out of her stupor by the attack, fired back with equal vitriol. "My arrogance. You were the one coaching me, telling me to demand more, telling me I deserved it. You were just as greedy as I was." Their bond, which had seemed so unified when they were plotting against me, was revealed to be nothing more than a partnership of convenience. Stripped of their common goal, their true feelings for each other, a toxic mix of rivalry and contempt surfaced with volcanic force. The mother-in-law, who was the mother she always dreamed of, was now her chief accuser. The daughter-in-law, who was her prized pupil in manipulation, was now a liability she was desperate to jettison. Their shared dream of a life of effortless luxury had devolved into a bitter blame game in the ruins of their own making. I watched this ugly spectacle unfold from a safe distance, feeling a profound and somber sense of closure. There was no joy in their suffering, no triumphant glee. There was only the grim satisfaction of a necessary surgery successfully completed. The cancer of their avarice had been excised in a painful but public procedure. Lucia was now completely alone, abandoned by the allies she had chosen over her own family. A bride left stranded at the altar of her own ambition. The grand reception, which I had paid for, continued in a muted, awkward fashion for a short time before guests began to make their excuses and depart. The vibrant celebration had become a wake. As people filed out, they cast furtive glances at the head table, where Lucia sat weeping silently, her perfect makeup ruined, and Veronica sat rigid with fury, staring into space. They were pariahs at their own party, isolated by the consequences of their own character. Marco eventually walked over to Lucia. He spoke to her quietly, his words inaudible to me, but his tone was not one of comfort. It was the tone of a man laying down the law. After a brief, tense exchange, he turned and left the hall alone. He did not look back. The rupture of that bond, the central relationship the entire event was meant to celebrate, was the final devastating consequence. Lucia had entered the evening as a triumphant bride, believing she had secured a life of status and wealth. She was ending it a humiliated woman, her social standing in tatters, her mother-in-law her enemy, and her new husband already walking away. The loss of status was a blow from which I knew they would struggle to recover. In their world, reputation was everything. The story of the wedding, where the bride's greed was exposed by the groom, would become a cautionary tale, whispered at every subsequent social gathering. They would be defined not by their aspirations, but by their spectacular, self-inflicted failure. Veronica, the masterful social climber, had taken a fall from which there was no elegant recovery. And Lucia had learned the hardest lesson of all: the admiration of others, when built on a lie, is as fleeting and insubstantial as smoke. I slipped out of the reception before the last of the guests had departed. My part was done. I had presented the facts, and the jury of their peers had delivered a swift and brutal verdict. The financial consequences of the trust were, in many ways, the least of their problems. The immediate punishment was the complete and utter destruction of the one thing they held sacred, their public image. They had tried to make me a nobody, and in doing so, they had revealed to the entire world that without my money, that is exactly what they were. The drive home was quiet. The night was dark, but my mind was clear. I'd not acted out of hatred, but out of a desperate final attempt at a kind of corrective love. I had held up a mirror to my daughter, forcing her to see the person she had become. The reflection was ugly, and it had shattered the glass, but it was the truth. The consequences of that truth were now hers to live with. The isolation she now faced was a direct result of her own actions. She had systematically pushed away the one person who loved her unconditionally, me, in favor of transactional relationships with people who valued her only for what she could provide. Now that the source of her value was gone, they were gone too. It was a harsh but vital lesson in the difference between genuine connection and superficial alliance. As I unlocked the door to my modest apartment, I felt the immense weight of the last few years begin to lift from my shoulders. The tension of living a double life, of playing the part of the fool while preparing for war, was finally over. The house was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of rightness, of an unbalanced equation finally being solved. The consequences were now in motion, an unstoppable chain reaction I had initiated. Lucia's world had been turned upside down. Stripped of her financial safety net, her social standing, and her key relationships, she was facing a future she was utterly unprepared for. She was at rock bottom, a place of profound loss and humiliation. It was a terrible place to be, but it was also the only place from which the long, difficult process of redemption could possibly begin. The initial phase of Lucia's new life was by all accounts a brutal baptism by fire. The reports I received from my lawyers, who were tasked with monitoring her compliance with the trust's conditions, painted a picture of profound dislocation. Marco, true to the quiet integrity I had sensed in him, stood firm. He supported my conditions entirely, seeing them not as a punishment, but as the only possible path forward for his wife. He gave up their lavish apartment, the lease for which was in my name, and moved them into a small, two-bedroom rental in a respectable but far from glamorous part of the city. For Lucia, this was not just a downgrade. It was an exile to a foreign land. Her first task was to confront the vast chasm between her accustomed lifestyle and their new, stark financial reality. Marco's salary, while comfortable for a normal person, was laughably inadequate to fund the life she believed she was owed. The first casualties were the symbols of her former self. The designer handbags, the unworn shoes still in their boxes, the jewelry given for birthdays she barely remembered. All was sold off, piece by painful piece, not for luxuries, but for groceries and utility bills. Each sale was a small death, a dismantling of the persona she had so carefully constructed. The hardest part for her, I was told, was selling her luxury car, the final emblem of her effortless mobility and status. Then came the indignity of the job hunt. With a resume that was a monument to mediocrity, a vague degree, and no significant work experience, she was utterly unprepared for the competitive realities of the labor market. Her ingrained sense of superiority was a liability in interviews, where her condescension was mistaken for a lack of interest. After dozens of rejections for the kind of glamorous marketing jobs she felt she deserved, desperation forced her to accept an entry-level position as an administrative assistant at a small, unremarkable logistics company. It was mundane, poorly paid work, the kind of job she would have openly sneered at just weeks before. Her new reality was the bottom of a well she had dug herself. The daily grind was a relentless assault on her ego. She, who had once spent afternoons at exclusive spas, now spent them filing invoices and answering phones under the harsh fluorescent lights of a drab office. Her colleagues were not the high society figures she sought to impress, but ordinary people concerned with mortgages and their children's school fees. They were polite but unimpressed by her background. In this new world, her name meant nothing, and her past life of privilege was a currency that had no value. She was forced, for the first time, to exist purely as herself, and she found the experience terrifyingly hollow. The mandatory therapy sessions began, as I expected, with furious resistance. The therapist's initial reports, which were sent to my legal team as per the Trust's protocol, described a young woman drowning in a sea of victimhood. Lucia spent the first several weeks railing against the injustice of it all. She painted me as a cruel, vindictive old man who had robbed her of her birthright. She portrayed Marco as a traitor who had sided with her tormentor. She saw the entire situation as a grand conspiracy designed to punish her for wanting a beautiful life, completely blind to the fact that her own actions were the sole architects of her predicament. The therapist, a patient and experienced woman, did not challenge these tirades directly. Instead, she gently but persistently guided Lucia back to the facts of her own choices. The combination of this professional guidance and the harsh, unyielding reality of her daily life began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, erode her defenses. The exhaustion from a full day's work, the anxiety of budgeting for the month, the quiet humility of having to depend on a paycheck she had earned herself, these experiences began to teach her a language her life of privilege had never included. The language of cause and effect. Slowly, her psychological transformation began. The anger in her therapy sessions started to be punctuated by moments of confusion, and then, eventually, by reluctant introspection. She began to talk less about my cruelty and more about her own anxieties. She spoke of the shame she felt when her credit card was declined at the supermarket. She described the small, gnawing fear of not being able to pay her share of the rent. These were not grand epiphanies, but small cracks in the armor of her entitlement, allowing the first rays of self-awareness to penetrate the darkness. This process was agonizingly slow, a gradual chipping away at a lifetime of flawed thinking. She began to observe her colleagues, not with disdain, but with a dawning curiosity. She saw them find joy in simple things, a shared joke, a child's drawing taped to a cubicle wall, plans for a weekend barbecue. She saw a richness in their lives that had been entirely absent from her own relentless pursuit of more. Their contentment, born from genuine connection and modest achievements, stood in stark contrast to the hollow, competitive social climbing that had once defined her entire existence. I am told the moment of clarity, when it finally came, was not a dramatic breakdown, but a quiet, intensely personal revelation. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. She had stayed late at work to help a co-worker, a single mother named Clara, finish a project before a deadline. It was the first time she had ever voluntarily done something for someone else without expecting anything in return. As they were leaving, Clara turned to her and said, "Thank you, Lucia. I really couldn't have done it without you. You're a good person." Then she insisted on sharing her umbrella with Lucia on the walk to the bus stop. That small, simple act of unreciprocated kindness shattered something within her. Sitting on the bus, staring out at the rain-streaked city lights, she finally understood. She understood that my actions hadn't been about money or control. They had been about this, about the value of contribution, the quiet dignity of work, the warmth of a genuine human connection. She saw that the world I had forced her into wasn't a punishment. It was a lesson. She finally realized that the consequences she was suffering were not a cruel vengeance, but the fair and just harvest of the shallow, selfish seeds she had sown her entire life. That evening, for the first time, she cried. Not tears of self-pity or rage, but tears of a profound and cleansing grief. Grief for the years she had wasted, for the relationships she had poisoned, and for the person she could have been. She finally saw me not as her jailer, but as the one person who had loved her enough to force her to confront the truth. The rage she had harbored against me for months simply dissolved, replaced by a deep and humbling shame. The subsequent therapy report noted a dramatic shift. Lucia arrived at her next session and began not with a complaint, but with a statement that marked the true beginning of her healing. "It was all my fault," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Everything that happened, I deserved it. My father was right." From that point forward, the therapy was no longer about fighting the past, but about building a future. She finally accepted full responsibility for her actions, and in that acceptance, she found the first taste of true freedom. Her growth from that point on was genuine and steady. Her motivation for work changed. It was no longer a humiliating sentence to be endured, but an opportunity to build something of her own. She started asking questions, learning the business, and taking initiative. Her supervisors, who had initially written her off as a spoiled princess, began to notice her dedication. The small paycheck she brought home each month became a source of immense pride, a tangible symbol of her newfound self-sufficiency. Her relationship with Marco began to heal and deepen. The bitterness and resentment were replaced by a new, shared respect. They were no longer partners in a lifestyle, but partners in life, navigating their challenges as a team. He saw the changes in her, the humility, the growing empathy, the quiet strength, and the love he had always had for the real Lucia was rekindled. They were building a marriage based not on status or wealth, but on the solid ground of shared effort and mutual support. She made no attempt to reclaim her old life. She cut ties with the superficial friends who had abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. She learned to cook, to manage a budget, and to find pleasure in simple things. A walk in the park, a movie night at home, a conversation with her husband that wasn't about what to buy next. She was discovering that a life of meaning was not built from possessions, but from character. I received a report that she had enrolled, on her own initiative, in an evening course on financial planning at a local community college, the very course required by the trust. She was no longer just fulfilling a clause to get her inheritance. She was genuinely seeking the knowledge to be a responsible adult. She wanted to understand the value of money, not just as something to spend, but as a tool to build a secure and stable life for herself and her husband. This new Lucia was someone I was beginning to recognize, a faint echo of the curious, bright little girl I had raised. A version of her I thought had been lost forever. Her transformation was not about becoming a perfect person overnight. It was about the daily choice to be a better one. She still struggled. She still had moments of doubt, but she was no longer running from her responsibilities. She was facing them, and in doing so, she was finding a strength she never knew she possessed. The most telling sign of her growth came in a brief note Marco sent to my lawyers. He mentioned that Lucia had started volunteering on weekends at a local soup kitchen. It was an act of pure altruism, done with no audience and for no reward. The woman who had once demanded a fortune to throw a party was now giving her free time to serve those with nothing. That single piece of information told me more than any therapy report ever could. My daughter, the one who had valued nothing but status, was now actively choosing a life of service and humility. She was learning that true wealth is measured by what you give, not by what you have. She was no longer seeking to build an empire of possessions, but a life of purpose. The path I had forced her onto had been brutal, but it had led her to a destination of character she would never have found on her own. I began to feel a sense of hope, a fragile but persistent belief that my drastic measures had not destroyed her, but had in fact saved her. I had taken away her fortune to give her a chance at finding her own worth. It was a high-stakes gamble, the most terrifying investment of my life. But the early returns were finally suggesting that it might, against all odds, pay off. Her redemption was not about pleasing me or winning back my money. It was a deeply personal journey of self-discovery. She was rebuilding her life not on the ruins of her old one, but on a new and solid foundation of integrity, hard work, and empathy. She was becoming a woman I could one day, perhaps, be truly proud of again. In forcing her to confront the poverty of her character, I had given her the opportunity to discover her own inner richness. The process was hers, the work was hers, and the emerging victory would be hers alone. My part in her life as the provider and protector was over. Another 2 years passed, bringing the total to 4 since that fateful wedding day. Time, the great smoother of rough edges, had allowed a new, stable reality to take root for all of us. I found my own legacy not in the fluctuations of the stock market, but in the predictable rhythm of the tides. My life in the small coastal town was quiet and purposeful. I had purchased a small sailboat, a modest vessel compared to the yachts of my past, and spent my days learning the intricate dance of wind and water. My peace was no longer a strategic defense, but a genuine state of being, born from a difficult decision that had ultimately set us all free. I was no longer a strategist or a warden. I was simply Roberto, a man at peace with his choices and his solitude. The reports from my lawyers had long since ceased being a source of anxiety and had become chronicles of quiet progress. Lucia and Marco had built a life for themselves, a life defined not by extravagance but by partnership. She had not only kept her job at the logistics company, but had earned a promotion to a junior management position. It wasn't a glamorous title, but it was one she had earned through her own merit and hard work. They had saved enough for a down payment on a small house with a garden. Their life was a testament to the fact that happiness is not found in abundance, but in shared purpose and mutual respect. They had found a humble stability that was infinitely more valuable than the brittle opulence they had once pursued. The final condition of the trust was met on the 3rd anniversary of the wedding. My lawyers received a formal letter from the therapist confirming Lucia's consistent and productive participation, alongside a certificate of completion for her financial management course. She had fulfilled every clause. As per the trust's design, this did not trigger a lump sum payment, but the activation of a modest annual stipend, enough to supplement their income and provide a safety net, but not enough to ever allow a return to her old lifestyle. The control was now hers, but it was a control she had earned, and I was confident she now had the wisdom to wield it responsibly. Our resolution was as quiet and deliberate as the rest of this journey. There was no dramatic, tearful reunion. The trust, once broken so fundamentally, could not be perfectly mended. A fine china plate once shattered will always show the cracks, no matter how skillfully it is glued back together. The first contact was a simple handwritten letter that arrived a month after the trust conditions were met. It contained no requests and no overwrought apologies. It was a simple update on her life, her work, her home. It ended with a single powerful sentence. "Thank you, Father, for not giving me what I wanted, but what I needed." I responded a week later, my own letter equally brief. I acknowledged her progress and wished her continued peace and happiness. And with that, a new, cautious line of communication was opened between us. We began to exchange occasional emails and later infrequent phone calls. The conversations were polite, sometimes even warm, but they were different. The old, easy dynamic of father and child was gone, replaced by a respectful distance between two adults who had been forged into new people by the same fire. The love was there, an undercurrent beneath the surface, But it was a sober, more realistic love, aware of the past but focused on the present. The true resolution was not in our repaired relationship, but in our individual peace. My daughter had found her dignity not in an inheritance, but in her own accomplishments. She had found a partner in Marco who loved her for the resilient woman she had become, not the heiress she was supposed to be. And I had found a quiet joy in my solitude, the joy of a man who had fulfilled his most difficult duty as a parent. We had each found our own separate peace on our own separate paths, and that was a far more meaningful conclusion than any forced reconciliation. My story, is ultimately a lesson in the true nature of wealth. For years, I believed my fortune was my legacy, a gift I could pass down to ensure my daughter's security and happiness. I was wrong. A fortune without character is a curse, a catalyst for greed and entitlement that hollows out the soul. True wealth is the self-respect earned through honest work, the integrity to take responsibility for one's actions, and the humility to learn from one's mistakes. These are the assets that never depreciate, the only inheritance that truly matters. I learned that the most effective form of justice is not punitive, but restorative. My goal was never to destroy Lucia, but to create the conditions under which she would be forced to rebuild herself. The consequences I imposed were not an act of vengeance, but a framework for her redemption. It was a harsh and painful process, but it led not to ruin, but to renewal. Justice, I now believe, is not about balancing the scales of past wrongs, but about setting a person on a path where they can learn to balance their own life. My legacy, as I see it now from the deck of my boat, watching the sun set over the ocean, is not the money in the trust. It is the wisdom of that difficult choice. It is the quiet strength of a daughter who found her own worth, the integrity of a son-in-law who chose character over comfort, and the peace of a father who learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is to let go and trust in the painful, beautiful process of consequence and growth. We are not the people we were, and for that I am eternally grateful. The broken relationship between a father and his child is a profound tragedy, but it is not always an end. Sometimes it is the beginning of a new understanding, one built on the hard-won ground of truth and mutual respect. Our story is not perfect and the scars remain, but it is real. It is a testament to the fact that even from the deepest betrayals, a bittersweet kind of grace can emerge, proving that people can change, and that true value lies not in what we possess, but in who we become. My life is simpler now, but infinitely richer. I no longer manage a portfolio of stocks. I manage a life of quiet contentment. The silence I once found so heavy is now filled with the sound of the waves and the satisfaction of a difficult job well done. I did not get the daughter I wanted, but Lucia became the woman she needed to be. And in the end, that is a far greater return on investment than I ever could have hoped for. Our story is a quiet reminder that respect cannot be inherited or demanded. It must be earned. Dignity is not a birthright. It is a choice made every single day. And sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is